This dust caused one of the worst occupational health disasters in U.S. history, and few people know about it. Hi, I'm Geology Joes, your friendly neighborhood geologist that enjoys somewhat unfriendly topics. I've enjoyed scary stories in the outdoors from a very young age, and have decided to combine my interests to give you Geology That Kills. If that sounds right up your alley, click that subscribe button and share this video with other outdoor ghouls and gals. In today's episode, we will look at an unlikely suspect that can be found all around us, causing damage, disease, and death right under our noses. Roughly 90% of Earth's crust is made up of silicate minerals. Silicate minerals are those that are comprised of silicon and oxygen in combination with other elements, quartz and feldspars being the most significant and abundant. These silicate minerals are found in all three rock types, including but not limited to obsidian, granite, quartzite, and sandstone. Why is this important to know? The answer is in the dust. When the silica-rich rocks erode and weather, either through natural or human-made processes, silica dust can be created. Silica dust in large volumes can be extremely dangerous to breathe in and will lead to a disease called silicosis with prolonged exposure. Silica dust is basically like little shards of glass, and when you inhale it, these fine particles cut up your lungs, leaving scarring called fibrosis. Silicosis can develop in three ways depending on exposure level. They are chronic silicosis, which happens when exposure to silica dust is low and takes 10 years to set in. Subacute silicosis is medium exposure and takes 2 to 5 years. Acute silicosis happens with heavy exposure and only takes a few months to set in. The timeline for and severity of silicosis may vary depending on the exposure level, type of silica dust, age, and other factors. Studies indicate that symptoms due to exposure to artificial silica dust actually appear faster than exposure to natural silica dust. This is likely due to a higher concentration of silica dust in artificial stone like concrete. Symptoms of silicosis include a constant cough, fatigue, shortness of breath, and chest pain. People with silicosis are at a greater risk of tuberculosis, lung cancer, kidney disease, and other autoimmune disorders. Silicosis may also develop into a condition called PMF, which may require a lung transplant. Lung damage from silicosis is irreversible and progressive, meaning that treatment is aimed at slowing down the disease and relieving its symptoms instead of curing it. Without treatment, it will become more difficult to breathe until the lungs stop working. Most cases of silicosis are work-related. Industries that are common breeding grounds for this disease include mining, construction, stonework, pottery, sandblasting, and foundry work. Things have gotten better since the foundation of OSHA, MSHA, and improved medical science, but it is a preventable disease that should not exist at all. It's a matter of employers making their staff aware of the workplace dangers and enforcing PPE. This is something I'm very familiar with as someone who has worked in environmental remediation. Safety was always prioritized, but I found a lack of education and urgency when it came to environmental hazards and protecting employee health. There were times that I should have been wearing a respirator, but didn't realize I needed it, because it was always, you can wear the PPE if you want, downplaying the potential dangers and health effects of prolonged exposure. But at least I had access to respirators and the option to wear one. In 1930s West Virginia, employees never even had a choice. It's called the Hawk Nest Tunnel Disaster, and you've probably never heard of it, even though it's one of the most deadly, if not the deadliest occupational health catastrophe the U.S. has seen. Of the estimated 2,900 employees who worked inside the tunnel, at least 764 workers died of silicosis. That's 26%. 26% of workers who went into that tunnel died, that we know of. We will learn why that death toll might actually be a lot higher. In 1930, construction began on a 3-mile tunnel through Gauley Mountain located between Ansted and Gauley Bridge, West Virginia. The tunnel, known as the Hawk's Nest Tunnel, would divert water from the New River to a hydroelectric plant downstream. This plant would produce electricity for Union Carbide's metal plant located in Alloy, West Virginia. However, building this tunnel was no small feat, and they hired hundreds of men to carve through 3 miles of solid silica-rich rock. And hundreds of men answered the call. During the Great Depression, people were desperate for work. The unemployment rate in West Virginia was 30% to 40%. Despite the male population being nearly 80% white in Fayetteville County, most tunnel laborers were non-local black immigrants from the South, drawn to West Virginia in the promise of good-paying jobs. Men worked on average 60 hours a week with Sunday off in 10 to 15-hour shifts. In the beginning, workers were paid 50 cents an hour, which decreased to 30 cents as the project continued. Comparatively, workers at the nearby coal mines earned about $1 per day. This high pay enticed many migrants, 2/3 of which were black. But this good pay was deceptive. White workers earned 5 cents more per hour and were paid in cash, while black workers were paid in scrip of $3 at the end of each shift. This scrip was a currency that could only be cashed at the company's commissary for a 10% charge. On top of that 10% surcharge, black workers had to purchase bed linens, coal, medical access, and other necessities, which put a dent in their income. Union Carbide signed a 2-year contract with Reinhardt and Dennis, a construction company, to manage this project. The contract specified that Reinhardt and Dennis would assume all liability and that engineers from New Kanawha Power could make changes in procedures if injuries were caused by employer negligence. The contract also stated that Reinhardt and Dennis would furnish and equip an on-site hospital. But this never happened. The contract also had incentives and penalties for meeting the 2-year target date. For each day it exceeded the target, Reinhardt and Dennis would pay $250, and New Kanawha Power would pay the contractor $250 for every day it beat the target. With an incentive like that, the goal was to get the job done as fast as possible, by any means possible, and that perhaps meant forgoing basic safety. Little to no training was given to these workers, and there was certainly no safety brief on the dangers. Now, at this time, there was no OSHA or MSHA to regulate mining operations. However, in 1910, Congress established the Bureau of Mines. The Bureau was in charge of conducting research and reducing accidents in the coal mining industry, but was given no inspection authority until 1941. Meaning it was up to employers to enforce the Bureau's recommendations. Even though mining was occurring on this project, the Hawk's Nest Tunnel was licensed as a civil engineering project and not a mining project, so even minimal forms of mine safety were not applied. Before construction began, Union Carbide took core samples along the proposed tunnel, finding high-grade silica. The original plan called for the tunnel to be 32 to 36 feet in diameter, but when that 99% pure silica was found, Union Carbide widened the tunnel to 46 feet in diameter to mine more silica to be used in its smelting operation. When construction began, despite the well-understood relationship between exposure to silica dust and silicosis, none of the involved companies measured dust levels in the tunnel. Reinhardt and Dennis only conducted 2 tests for carbon monoxide during the project. Dry drilling techniques were used for vertical drilling to remove the silica-rich material since it was faster than wet drilling, which uses water to suppress dust. From personal experience, dry drilling can create huge plumes of silica dust. Now imagine that you are in an enclosed and cramped space with no ventilation and no respirator with a dense cloud of silica dust perpetually circulating. The workers were most assuredly coughing and hacking, and their lungs had to burn. I know just being around that dust in an open space has my lungs burning at the end of the day. Witnesses described black diggers emerging from the tunnel covered with layers of white dust as they hauled the silica-rich debris from the tunnel, which was the dirtiest and deadliest work. But masks were only supplied to inspectors and company men inside the tunnel, not to the workers. Even after the director of the West Virginia Department of Mines inspected the tunnel, wrote a letter to New Konawa Power warning of the hazards of silicosis, and ordered respirators to be given to the laborers, workers received neither respirators nor warnings, even though the law required warnings to be posted. Eventually, the West Virginia Department of Mines pushed Reinhardt and Dennis to install a ventilation duct, and they did. But it was widely acknowledged that the small tube they installed was ineffective because of holes in the tube caused by falling rocks. Workers reported that 12 to 16 workers were carried out during each shift after collapsing from carbon monoxide poisoning from engine exhaust. Dynamite was used to blast through the sandstone, and the break between work shifts was alleged to be 2 hours to allow the dust to settle. However, in as few as 30 minutes, supervisors forced the workers, often through violent force, 400 feet down the tunnel into a cloud of dust with visibility restricted to 4 to 5 feet. The combination of large work crews drilling and blasting underground, lack of dust suppression, exhaust from gas engines, inadequate ventilation, and no PPE all contributed to elevated levels of silica dust exposure. There were also no shower facilities, so workers carried contamination back to their shacks. In other words, there was no escaping the dust. There was no such thing as old-timers here. Within months, workers became sick with silicosis and died shortly after. Only 40% of the underground workforce worked more than 2 months, and only 20% more than 6 months. There was a constant cycle of new workers in the tunnel, so there was no one who had been there long enough to really warn incoming workers on the dangerous effects of these working conditions. They had to find out for themselves when eventually they became bedridden due to breathing difficulties. But this was not a good enough excuse. Black workers faced armed shack roosters who policed the camps and worksite for the contractor and often forced sick workers into the tunnels. Those who were too weak to keep working were kicked out of company housing, which for black workers were cramped shacks with up to 15 men. These homeless workers stayed to die in Gauley Bridge, a town that would be known as the town of the living dead. Reinhardt and Dennis decided the most cost-effective way to handle this crisis was not to acknowledge the dangers and provide safer conditions, but instead to deny the reality of the situation and complete the tunnel as quickly as possible, which they did in September of 1931, 10 weeks ahead of schedule, meaning they made an extra $17,000, which is the equivalent of over $300,000 today. Reinhardt and Dennis claimed to not know the hazards of silica dust, which seems unlikely. Silicosis is considered the oldest occupational disease and was first documented by the Greek physician Hippocrates in 430 BC. Yet doctors who worked for Union Carbide lied to the workers and gave them useless placebo pills to cure their ailment and falsely diagnosed them with pneumonia, tuberculosis, or tonsillitis. When these workers died, they incorrectly listed their cause of death on their death certificates, which Reinhardt and Dennis later used to claim that there were few, if any, silicosis deaths at the tunnel. Black workers who died were not buried in local cemeteries because they were designated as whites only. Instead, they were dumped in unmarked mass graves wearing the clothes they died in and covered with tunnel rock. Out of hundreds, records show that the remains of only 10 black men were shipped to their homes. The families of the remaining victims had to assume the worst, never receiving closure. Many of the forgotten bodies were exhumed and moved due to later construction projects. Then, in 2009, a memorial to the 764 Hawks Nest Tunnel victims was placed in Somerville, West Virginia. As the disaster was investigated by the Congressional Subcommittee, it was discovered that the involved companies destroyed or hid medical records and historical records of worker deaths. This is one of the many reasons the death toll could be higher. The first semi-official death count stated that approximately 300 people died from silicosis, and that an additional 1,500 workers had been diagnosed with acute silicosis. Since Social Security did not exist and many workers left to go back to the South after the project, it's hard to come up with an exact death count. Multiple studies have the death toll at over 1,000. According to some researchers, it was found that out of 1,213 employees who worked at least 2 months digging at Hawks Nest Tunnel, over 60% died within 7 years from silicosis. Many lawsuits were filed against the company from about 300 survivors and relatives requesting millions in damages. During this process, there is considerable evidence that the contractor bribed witnesses and tampered with juries. There were settlement awards, but they were based on ethnicity and marital status instead of severity of illness. Survivors of an unmarried black man would receive $400, and those of a married black man would receive $600. On the other hand, survivors of an unmarried white man received $800, and those of a married white man, $1,000. The total monetary amount of damages represented just over 1% of the project cost, meaning that the companies involved shelled out pennies. In 1936, the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Labor convened a hearing on the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster, which management representatives from the involved companies declined to attend. Reinhardt and Dennis submitted a letter denying any wrongdoing and denounced witness testimony. The committee found that during the project's duration, there was a complete and inhumane disregard for the health, lives, and future of their employees, which resulted in the development of silicosis and inevitable death due to the negligence of the employing contractor. Despite the clear proof of negligence, no action was taken against the involved companies. As for press coverage, there was an intentional cover-up by West Virginia government officials, newspapers, and other entities, possibly leading to its obscurity today. It wasn't until 1986, 55 years after the incident, that West Virginia finally agreed to place a marker at the site dedicated to the men who died there. If you want to see the partial list of names of the victims, I will provide a link in the description. The Hawks Nest Tunnel still exists today, generating 107 megawatts of electricity to the alloy plant, a symbol of the never-ending greed that plagues our world despite the irrefutable destruction. Despite regulations and PPE improving, silica dust still poses a risk to about 2 million construction workers in more than 600,000 workplaces, and will continue to pose a risk if employers aren't held accountable for negligence. The Hawks Nest disaster has left a mark on me ever since I first learned of it. I chose this footage from the BLM movement because of the disturbing parallels between this event in 1930 and the continued disregard and violence against Black people today. It's so important that we remember events like this so history doesn't repeat itself. In recent years, there have been attempts to dismantle worker rights which protect us from employer oversight. To prevent this from happening, it's imperative that we use our voices to educate our neighbors and demand action from government officials. United, we are strong, and we can bring change to make our world a safe and equitable place for all. That's all for Geology That Kills. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and leave a comment down below. Don't forget to subscribe, and please, if you live in the desert like me, watch out for the dust.